Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of BLS032 Show and Tell with Lars Brink. Lars, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on a short note, but here I am.
Yeah, it was a short notice. I had some changes in the schedule, and 24 hours ago, I reached out to Lars after one of my viewers asked, "Hey, can you bring Lars on again?" So for me, that was like the best way to invite Lars. You've been on the show, I think, 5 times, 6 times, maybe something like this
I'm
along
not
those
keeping
lines.
track.
Me neither. I know you're the runner-up to Chow, which is basically the major resident in terms of my guests, but you're a close second. Since the last time, I think there's 2 new initiatives that you might want to share with the community that are interesting. So,
Yeah, probably. So the first one is I'm managing in my spare time. I'm managing 2 publications on dev community. Most of you probably know the dev community or dev.2.
yeah,
So I have 2 publications there, and one of them is called This is Angular, and the other
right.
one is called This is Learning. It's the I'm behind both of them. I run a private Discord server for the authors, and it's a place for you to publish your content. Anyone can join, anyone who's a tech writer or content creator. One of them is obviously about Angular technologies, the other one is about every other technology and everything related to being a developer, careers, and job interviews and whatnot, preparing for that. We're actually also collaborating on an RxJS course, a text-based one for free. So this is learning the whole organization, and part of that is this is Angular is all about sharing. So sharing is caring, and
Yeah,
as an author, I mean, there's not really any rules or any like requirements for the quality. So even entirely new writers can join, and they do, and then you can get some feedback and some good tips and a mentor and a place to
very cool.
publish your content and get more discoverability. Actually, on dev community, it's much stronger to publish on a so-called organization or publication than on your own. You'll get much more visibility. I don't know. Their algorithms work that way, and it seems to help a lot to publish together as a group.
Nice, very cool. And this is Angular. I think you started about, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 months ago, something like this, along those lines. And
It was in November, and it's starting to pick up in terms of number of authors and views and so on. So that's really nice to see that you can do that with the dev community.
very cool. Yeah, I think Dev 2 is a great resource for written content. And I think every week I see you introducing a new writer that writes for This is Angular. Also, a few big names in the community, if that's what you're interested. But I also really like to see that there's a place for basically new writers or people that are not that on the forefront of the community, probably still have a place to go. So that's pretty cool. And another thing is that you started a live stream.
I did. I needed something to pass my time. So no, I was running a podcast right last year,
Right.
but I was connected to a business, and uh, it's not running anymore. So I got inspired by people like you and Santosh, and so I wanted to do a little live streaming. It's not a talk show; it's just me live coding, different topics, an hour or so, maybe 2, depending on how difficult things get. So we actually have a lot of discussion right now about like what's the benefit of live streams. So that's
Right.
an interesting topic. There's some critique saying it's like waste of time for you and for the audience. You should do a video series, fully edited and stuff like that. Well, I do it because I like it, and if a few people join, like yourself, I really enjoy that. Just having one message in the chat, and I'll be happy to answer any questions on the spot as well.
Yeah.
And yeah, surely I could make a more short and succinct video about something, but I think that's part of the journey, is like seeing that even people who are very experienced with, for example, Angular, can also trip over the simple things and make
Hmm.
mistakes. So it's kind of, to me, it's more like social media with filters and showing off the best highlight of the year rather than the day-to-day thingy, right? It's the same here. Like I I want to show off that side as well, that things are hard even for people who do it every day for 10 years.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's I've been looking at semicolons, or maybe it's a touchy subject after yesterday's tweets, but missing a semicolon in one character somewhere can get you stuck for a day or a few hours at least, and it's very nice to see. I personally, I started live streaming more or less because we started the Discord and we had a live stream channel, and I was inspired, like you, by people. In my case, I was on Brandon's show and I was on Zach's show as a guest. And I've seen Santos, of course, doing stuff. And it really inspired me. And I've always wanted to share stuff. And what I really like about doing live stream, in the sense that you do it live coding, you can just pop it on, stream it, and then you're done. And I've been doing video content for years. And it's super hard for me to motivate it because I'm a perfectionist and I want it to be good.
Right.
And I look up to people like Fireship. And when I see their videos, I see it's not always perfect. He also has glitches and he lives with it, and I need to, this is something I need to learn, really learn, appreciate. But I think it's generally just good to go out there and do stuff, and at some point you might realize, like, hey, I want to do other content. So I've been checking quite a bit of gaming streams where people play a game. I'm not a gamer, but I can appreciate some games, mostly city builders like City Skylines. And what these people do is not live stream it, but they basically record a stream, and everything where it gets boring, where you have to wait. So in our case, that might be code generating or repeating the same thing. They basically speed it up. So you don't have to wait if somebody implements a feature. So let's say I'm going to build an app and I'm going to build another CRUD controller, let's say something that's going to be the same as the last tree. I can just speed it up and show in 1 minute what I did. And I'm thinking about experimenting with that format as well. So I'm a bit in between because I don't want to do all the editing, and I do want to show something like real and something that's interesting enough.
But you'll also you're going to lose some of that in the moment. Like, people are actually watching as you do it, and they can interact with you if you do it that way.
Yeah.
So that's the backside of that, the metal, in doing it that way. Of course, it would be a better use of their time if you boil it down to 5 minutes, but you lose the personal touch and the motivation, I should say. It's hard work editing text or video or whatever and boiling it down to be short and succinct. It's really hard work.
Yeah, no, couldn't agree less. And on the note of live interaction, we have our Swedish visitor, Bill. It's
Nice.
not, his name is not Bill, but online he is. Nice to see you. Nice to see you back here. Also a long-time visitor of my stream.
Hi, Bill.
Yeah, Bill. That's cool. No, I love it. I wish I had a more English name at some point. Might have been useful. Anyway, cool. So that's cool to see. Now, today, we're going to talk about Spectacular from the Ngworker team. And I actually checked the repo and I saw that it's mostly you building it at this point, although even though it's the team, but it's cool that it's come from the org.
Yeah. By the way, my live stream is called Angle After Dark, so look for that on YouTube. Also, sometimes on Twitch. I'm trying to figure out like the platform, but definitely YouTube.
Cool.
So find it there. Just follow me and to find it. But yeah, Spectacular. Yeah, it's true that I wrote basically all of the code, but we are a group of we have an open source group, Ngworkers. So we are 4 people that know each other and trust each other. And while my name is on the commits, they help with the design and the feedback and I probably wrote the documentation as well. But they gave me good feedback on the design of the whole thing, and that made it great in the end. So
Cool.
it's also their product in that way, and that's what we forget sometimes. Like it doesn't matter how many commits you have your name on; you can also contribute in other ways than code.
Yeah, no, totally agree. That's definitely an important factor. So then, Ngworker, Nacho Vasquez,
Yes.
Santos,
Yes.
yourself, and who's the fourth? Who am I forgetting?
Serkan Sipai.
Serkan. Cool.
Yeah, he's German and has origins in Turkey.
Yep. Yeah. I definitely know Serkan. I'm going to invite him soon to be on the show and hopefully talk some Go. We have a shared love for Go and hope to do some of that. Okay, so cool. So that's the Ngworker team. And Where I know Ngworker from is Lumberjack, featured a few episodes ago. Great logging library, still on the roadmap to add to NXPM. But today, Spectacular. And could you give a brief overview to what Spectacular is, and what are some competing / similar libraries? I don't really believe in competition, but what could you use as an alternative so people get an idea?
Yeah, so Spectacular is a testing library for Angular. There's a lot of those. They all try to hide away some of the framework and testbed boilerplate, because there's so many different aspects of an Angular application, and you test each one in a different way.
Right.
But you do, for all of them, you need the testbed if you're doing unit or integration tests. Of course, you can do end-to-end tests. So Spectacular comes with 3 APIs in the first version here. And one of them is a pipe testing API, but it's an integration pipe testing API. So it will make it easy to test it in a template. It'll do a host component for your pipe very seamlessly, and you can pass values to it. You can read what's rendered in the DOM. So it's definitely for pipes that output content to the DOM, not pipes that are used to data binding, like the async pipe, for example.
Right. Yeah.
But if that's what you have, it will integration test it so that you can see which, what does it look like to pass multiple parameters, and does that work as expected, rather than testing it as a class and passing parameters to the method. But did you make an assumption? Did you forget how they actually work in a template? In this way, you get more of an end-to-end or a very deep integration test with the Angular pipe and template system and all of that, the whole way.
But as I understand it correct, it's still in isolation. So a new component is created, and there you basically set it up, everything to need to test, but you don't run the whole app.
Yeah. Right now, it's like you pass it a pipe. You say, this is the pipe I want to test. This is its pipe name, and this is the value I want to pass. And then
Right.
it creates what we call a harness, a testing harness for this pipe. So Spectacular will create the component behind the scenes and put the pipe in the template. You can control the template. By default, it'll just pass this value through to the pipe. But you can combine it with other pipes by controlling the template. But you don't have to if you don't need it. And after setting up the initial pipe, you can then query what's the text value that is being output by passing the value through the pipe. And then following that, if you need to, you can actually change the value or change the template and go through the whole thing again. And it's a very imperative API. It's like accessing properties, setting properties, and getting properties. So it's meant to be really simple and easy to set up. So that's the idea for that API.
Very cool. So, okay, that's one of the 3 parts you mentioned.
Yes.
Pipe testing.
The next, let's see. There's a big one, but I want to mention the other ones first. Let's see if I can remember.
If you like, we can open up the source code so you can have a...
I think I have it now. It's called the application testing API. This one is for yet another Angular specific thing that can be hard to test, even with the testbed. This is about application initializers and bootstrap listeners and configuration modules that provide those. How would you test that? It's actually pretty complicated, and there are some edge cases, and when you combine it with an async bootstrap application initializer and async bootstrap listener, which is often the case, it'll become even harder. So it's the same idea again, that you set it all up, and it actually bootstraps a whole Angular application behind the scenes, but you're just passing, these are the initializers I want to test, and these are the bootstrap listeners I want to test. And then it runs through the whole Angular lifecycle, bootstraps an application with a special component, and there's a real DOM, and then you can check for the side effects after the fact. So it's trying to make that experience as seamless as possible and as similar to the real application as possible. You provide the initializer directly, or you import a module that provides that initializer or bootstrap listener.
Very cool. And these are things that are generally only done in end-to-end, I imagine.
Well, yeah, I don't know. They're they're hard to test in general.
Yeah.
But yeah, surely, or I mean, depends on what you're going to do with one of these initializers. One of the use cases is like configuring some library. It could be a date time library or something like that, initializing that, or some other JavaScript library or what do you know. And that's not something you would test in an end-to-end test, really, because
Right.
you can't see that it happens until like, okay, if I initialize this translation library correct, I should see a Spanish text or whatever. So you can do it that way, sure, with an end-to-end testing library, but that's like shooting birds with a cannon. So
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
much more granular, but it's not unit test. It's still an integration test, and there's actually a whole Angular application being bootstrapped behind the scenes.
Very cool.
And
Nice.
I have to mention that I had to look into the Angular source code to find inspiration. They had a setup for a specific part of the framework for testing it, and I stole some of that and modified it a bit. So credits to the Angular team for some of it, and I built upon that.
Very
It was
cool. But
not part of the framework itself; it was only part of a test suite. So I had to dig really deep to find something about that.
cool. But does this also mean you can basically bootstrap Angular apps in a non conventional way? For instance, multiple Angular apps.
Probably
Yeah.
we could figure something out.
Nice. It's not that I have
Some
the use case, but I know this is something that's been asked at times. Can I render
yeah,
two apps in the same thing?
that would be interesting for say Angular elements or micro
Right.
frontends, and
Right.
those are both getting more popular over time. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's something we could look into if we have a good use case and an example. But so some of this is actually reused for the third and final, and probably the most useful API. This is the feature testing API of Spectacular, and it has the same. They all have the same concept of you pass it some options for what you want to test. It's a function, and you get back and a data structure or an interface that has the type of Spectacular feature testing harness or something like that. So it has a bunch of properties that might be useful to you. This is somewhat similar to Spectator, another Angular testing library with a similar name, a really good one, but Spectacular focuses on a few specific Angular specific things that are really hard to test yourself. So in the feature testing API, you pass it an Angular module, a feature module, a routed feature module. So
Right.
it can contain a bunch of components and services and whatnot, a route, even routes, right? So you say, this is my scope of this test. I want to test this whole feature. So one of the options you give to when creating a feature harness is the module you want to test and the route path, say heroes or dashboard or whatever that you use also in the application. And those are basically the only options you need to say, this is what I want to test. And it'll set up the application, it'll set up routing, it'll configure the test bed, it'll configure um, the router testing module, which is barely documented. So yeah, we can get into a few more details about this. This is probably the most interesting part.
Very cool.
But the idea was, this was something I was chasing for a year. How can we integration test an application or like a whole feature of an application, not just one component or a few related components, like looking at the perspective of from the user's perspective. How can we
Yeah.
test as a user? Similar to end-to-end test, but with the speed of the test bed, the flexibility of the test bed, and but across components, across routes. That's what I wanted to find out, and to get there, I was like exploring the whole router testing module, the source code, every piece of content out there, and I wrote 3 articles as part of that, explaining how can you test route guards, routed components, routing components, both using how would you do it in a more isolated unit test, but how then can you do it with the router testing module? Because all the classes and interfaces related to the router, like the activated route service and all those like snapshots and all that, those are really deep and complex objects. So stubbing those out or faking them would be a pain.
Yeah.
So that's what the router testing module can do for you, but
Right.
it's not really well documented how to use it. So that's what I want to figure out. I wrote 3 articles about it, and the end goal was figuring out how can I integration test a whole feature or maybe even a whole app using the test bed.
Sounds pretty cool and pretty useful, actually. And I think end-to-end tests are, for me, the most easy to wrap my head around, because it's just start up and you can see, and with Cypress even more, you get like movies of what it did, and that's all pretty cool. But I can totally imagine if you have like a very large app that you just want to maybe one section check it out, but you do want to check, for instance, I can imagine save some item, you go back, you navigate back to the detail page of that item, or you delete an item and you get back, navigate it to the list view, and you can verify that the thing is actually gone in isolation.
Also, think about, we just discussed micro front ends. What do you require to like build a micro front end?
What is required?
Yeah, what would you need?
Well, I think a hosting application at first, where you wire it all up, and then some
What if you
system.
don't have that?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So let's do an experiment. If you could share your screen and go to the repo, the Ngworker repo where Spectacular lives.
Can go here, and then we have, bump this up a few notches. And then in here, Ngworker is the repo on GitHub. And then inside here, we see at this moment one package. And
others being worked on. Yeah. Yeah, this is the one that's released. Okay, so in the, like, this is the very sparse documentation, but it's a starting point, and we put a lot of effort into doing inline documentation. So when you call the APIs, you'll get an explanation of what it is and what it does, and things like that. So at least you have that, and you have this very basic one. We need to figure out some way of generating documentation and putting it on a website. That'll be for some other time.
Yeah.
But at least this is, you have an API reference, you have the inline docs, JS docs.
Right. And this is TypeScript helping you out, right? In that case.
TypeScript. Well, you don't need TypeScript for that. You can do, well, TypeScript helps, sure. You could have done it just with the JS doc comments. That would be more elaborate and prone to getting out of date. But yeah, it's TypeScript plus some comments to each method and so on. Sure.
Okay, cool. And I think
this is the whole API.
Yeah. So there's a bunch of functions. The create, I see here, create application harness.
Yeah.
With options, and then create feature harness. I can imagine create pipe harness. There you go. And then a few other utilities. I think for the app today, we're most likely going to be interested in the feature testing one.
Yeah.
Which is, I think you also showed in your, I think it was Saturday, your live stream, where you went on testing Tours of Heroes.
This was with Zach DeRose on his stream, I guess.
Okay. Cool.
Oh, Angular After Dark as well. Yeah, right.
Yeah, last Saturday, I think I saw you doing this. Very cool. Is there
I'm mixing things up. The episode with Zach was about Ngworkers, but we were also discussing Spectacular, I guess. So yeah.
Right. Cool. Is there anything specific you'd like to show us on this page?
Yes. If you go not on the README file, but in the code, if you navigate into further down to the library, and then we should look for the feature testing API, the bottom file, the integration test here.
The Crisis Center integration spec. I love the name.
Yeah. The Crisis Center is part of the Tour of Heroes tutorial. It's actually the routing tutorial on Angle.io. So I put that into a library, a feature library, and then I namespaced it here to Tour of Heroes Crisis Center. So this is the most complex part in the Angular documentation, the most complex example of everything related to routing. So I figured if I can test all of that, it's a good library.
Yeah.
So that's what I spent a year doing.
Very cool. In fact,
So
I did
yeah.
Tours of Heroes when I started out, but it was like probably 2016, 2017, something like that. I haven't really looked at it, so I'm not familiar with the Crisis Center, but yeah.
It's because it's in the routing tutorial. It's in a separate section of the documentation.
Right. But from what I'm looking, this is about 120 line file. And with this, you test the whole routing functionality. Everything that gets explained gets tested in this file.
Well, I don't test everything, but the most complex use cases, I think.
Right.
But the very interesting thing here is if you scroll back to the top to the imports, and you see we import from this feature library as it is, but
This,
try to find an app in
yeah.
this repo. Try to find an app, an actual application.
Yeah, I can imagine that's not there. One thing that is, I'm curious where UI comes from.
So these are some utilities used in these tests. It's a custom one. It's not part of the public API because, as we'll get to, it's not meant to be. Sorry if you can hear something, some weird noises. It's my dog. I have an office dog today. It's a French bulldog.
That's all right. We're very dog friendly here on the stream, so that should be totally fine.
Nice. So it was Spectacular is also designed to be used together with another library, and you can do your own like we did here. That's not a really nice experience. You should use what's already out there and took years to perfect. So you can integrate it with either the Angular testing library, part of the testing library family of libraries, or the component harnesses from Angular CDK.
Very cool.
But here I'm just creating something very basic for interacting with the DOM and querying the DOM just for the sake of testing.
Nice. Very cool.
Yeah, but what I wanted to show you, if you try to find a file in this repo, like try to find the Tour of Heroes application.
That's not.
You're familiar with an NX monorepo.
Yeah.
So try to find that in the code base.
Whole app.
Yeah, and the whole monorepo. Try to find the Tour of Heroes app.
I mean, I would probably start looking for the app module, which I cannot find.
No such luck.
And another thing I can imagine is router module for root, because that's another.
It's not there.
It's not there. It's all hidden away. Yeah, pretty cool. Pretty cool.
Why would you need that?
Yeah.
We just developed the whole feature, and I just show you we tested it.
Yeah.
There's no app.
So where is it?
There is no app. You don't need one.
Okay.
We're a micro front-end team. We developed this feature in isolation.
Very cool. Yeah. So something will host it at some point, but we don't need it to test it.
Right. We can just use the test bed, and we're golden. Could you do this with an end-to-end testing framework?
No, probably not. You need your whole app. You probably need maybe even the tweaked version of it if you're getting fancy. But yeah, very nice.
So this is what I wanted to get at. You can test a whole feature in isolation. You don't even, to the point you don't even need an application project.
Now, when I look at this, is this also something with your is the way you implement this related to your critics you have with Angular modules, which is probably a pretty shared sentiment, because I don't see you building a lot of modules either. Looks like you hide these all cleanly away.
I took the Crisis Center as is.
Right.
I maybe I added like one variable, the Crisis Center path, because it wasn't exposed. Right. But that was basically it. And I put a fake service in there for the purpose of testing. That's
Right.
it. The actual source code is untouched because I didn't want to cheat. I wanted
Yeah.
to say, even this. It's a really messy application actually. This Crisis Center of the Two of Heroes. So I figured if I can test that, I'm good. It's a good
Yeah.
library
You should be good to go.
because like one of the things that tests give you on like integration and especially unit test is you end up like identifying where your design could be improved. And I found a lot of those when trying to test it, but I didn't want to cheat and say, of course, there is a better design and you can test it more easily. Like, that's the purpose of this thing. You don't have to worry about components or services. You test the whole thing, the whole feature
Yeah.
with everything in it, all the components, all the services, and so on.
Very cool.
So it's the test as a user approach, but it's closer to a, it's not a unit test, it is an integration test, so it's something in between the end-to-end tests frameworks and a traditional test bed unit test.
Very cool.
And
Can you see this taking more place than, for instance, an end-to-end test? Can you see your end-to-end tests being smaller or less focused than when you have these ones?
what do you mean?
So let's say, because I think most classic apps, at least the apps I worked on that were tested, were pretty heavy on end-to-end and some unit tests for more like logic kind of things. But you also generally not try to test. You're not trying to test the framework. That's kind of bad practice, waste of time also. And I can imagine that if you have something like this, that your end-to-end test might get smaller, less interesting, maybe, or less needed. Maybe that's the better way to say it. If there's, do you
Yeah,
think there's overlap, or it's gonna lean towards doing this more?
well, surely it depends on your team and your experience. Like if you're very familiar with Cypress or Protractor, whatever, use that. um,
Yeah.
like they can do the same thing, right?
Right.
I mean, this one has a big bit of flexibility because it is a white box. You do know what the angular parts are, so you can replace them if it makes it easier to test it, and it doesn't. You don't lose, like your assessment is that you don't lose confidence in what you're testing. But ideally, you shouldn't be replacing much except maybe a few browser native APIs, maybe the backend, similar to an end-to-end test. You might also want to stub out the backend. Spectacular can't help you with that. If you want to like stub out a backend, you'll need maybe mock service worker. Except if you replace a service with a fake instead,
Yeah.
then Spectacular can help you out. But then you're not testing that service. This fake dialog example is actually an example of the real dialog service calls the confirm, the JavaScript confirm global function,
Right.
which is like, who would do that? But they do that in the Crisis Center for some reason.
Well, it's a crisis
Luckily,
center.
yeah, yeah, but they did wrap it. They were nice enough to wrap it in a service, which means that I can replace it here. So I replaced it with a fake implementation that has the same API, but it just uses observables and subjects to and exposes these. Click the OK button in the prompt, click the cancel button in the prompt. There is no prompt, but it uses the same API as this dialog service. So to the application code, it's the same.
Yeah.
I had to stop that out because I can't call the OK button of an confirm prompt. I don't know if you can do that in end-to-end testing frameworks. You can't really in
I,
unit and integration tests.
I wouldn't know, but I can definitely imagine it's hard because it's your browser doing it. So you're basically giving away control to
Yeah,
the
you're
browser.
outside of the application at that point, so I don't really know.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, so that's an example of where the flexibility of having the test bed available can actually help you. And Spectacular, like every other Angular testing library, is built on top of the test bed. It just hides it away behind an API. But uh, as you see here, we provided it in an option, right? We're not
Yeah.
interacting with testbed directly, but we can pass in providers and imports similar to the testing module of the raw Angular testing API.
Very cool. Very cool.
So it's the purpose is you don't have to touch the test bed. You should have everything you need right here
Right.
in the Spectacular API.
Very cool. So one question that I have when looking at this, the describe before each and it and expect, etc. Where do these come from? Are these implemented by Spectacular, or are you using some other library to do these kind of things to set this all up?
This is Jest.
Right. Okay. So this Spectacular depends on Jest for doing all these kind of, I'm not sure how you
No.
call them.
Spectacular is framework agnostic when it comes to testing frameworks.
Okay.
So there's nothing about Jasmine or Karma or Jest or anything like that. This is just we're testing Spectacular right here.
Okay.
We're
So
testing the integration testing framework, which is kind of fun.
Kind of meta. But we could pop this in other testing frameworks, like you said, Jasmine, and this should also work with that. So,
we happen to use Jest in Ngworker.
Yeah.
But it's the same. Like before each is also available in Jasmine and Karma.
Yeah.
And like before each and it and describe, those are the more or less standard names of a BDD style testing framework. Like Jest also has test, but it also has it, like we see here, because it wants to also support that standard BDD style interface of grouping your tests.
I like to see that, and it was. It's also nice to see that this is the thing you focus on. You're not building a test runner. You're building an easy way, a wrapper around Angular tests.
It was also important to me not to have something that's Jasmine specific. That was or Jest for that matter. That was a problem with Spectator. It was using Jasmine Spice specifically, so you were only able to use it with Jasmine. I helped kind of figure out how to get around this problem. So we designed /Jest if you're using Jest. So you'll use Spectator /Jest or something.
Right. When I did the episode with testing component store, we used Jest in NX, and Chow explained me that /Jest is there. Yeah.
Yeah, but those are not the only two testing frameworks in the world. So I just wanted something that was agnostic of whatever testing framework you're using. And that's what Angular did itself. The router testing module is not specific to Jasmine, neither is the HTTP client testing module or the test bed or anything like that. You do have to have some, like for the test bed itself and all, there's a lot of Angular set up. So they do have something specific for setting it up and hooking it to Jasmine, and Karma is built on top of Jasmine. So to use Jest, you need something on top of that. That's the Jest Angular preset, which is integrated into something like NX, for example. So you don't see it, but it's there.
Yeah. Yeah, this is one of the first things when I first started testing years ago. I was like, where does this describe come from? How does it all work? But this is kind of the provided basic things.
So what do you think of the create feature harness method there?
So when I see
Line
this,
30.
when I see this, it's what's here. So I'm not a huge tester, as you probably know. What's here, what I expect is that you can do certain setup, like the providers. This is definitely something I would expect, so you can stop things. So I can imagine this works as expected. If I would just the dialog service to be there and not to actually use it, I can probably just stub it with an object or an empty function and just do something like this. So up until that ground familiar. I'm a bit surprised to see mentions of paths in general in unit tests. It's not a unit test, but it's not an end-to-end test. So for me, that automatically goes to the other end. It's probably not a most correct way to view it, but I'm kind of surprised. Other than that, I think it looks like it makes a lot of sense to do it this way, honestly. And then you later call this harness to make it do things. So what I've seen is that you use, like, I think line 25 here, I'll highlight it, 25 here, you use harness.location. And I saw harness.route. Here, there you go. harness.router. So this kind of gives me an idea that the harness is a layer on top. It's basically a convenience layer, if I can put it that way. That that really helps me do certain things or certain things for my apps.
It's funny you should mention it, because the router property here and the other one,
The location.
there's one called location. I think they are services added by. It's not the native router and the native location. It's special ones, by feature location and feature router services by Spectacular. Because you can use this tilde, which means feature relative routes.
This was another thing that I was like, meh, I don't know. I know the dollars. I know the hashtag we have in routes at some. If you choose to enable that, I have not seen the tilde, but I do know from the Unix world, tilde is my root or home dir, whatever you want to call it, and
your home here is the feature. So it's
Very
just
nice.
it's just so that you don't have to pass in that crisis center path in all of these test cases. So it's just to get rid of some duplication.
But also,
you can,
also this already is a nice test, because at sometimes you might be tempted to pass in the path in some of your components. Let's say I want to redirect to the detail item after I created a contact. I want to go to contact detail, and I might be choosing to do, you know what, I'm just going to route to /contacts/ID, and that'll be fine for now, until you run it here and it says no go, because I don't have a /contacts here. So in that sense, I think
that's the reason why we need to pass that feature path. It's because the route paths are hard coded in magic strings all over templates in all kinds of components, and the router it's also passed as configuration to the router module. So that's why we need it here, because it might be hard coded somewhere. So we need to set it up to the same path as in the application.
Very cool.
Because initially I wanted an API where just say, this is the module I want to test. But then I learned that the hard way that they are hard coded. So if you don't have the same path prefix, some links will be broken when testing the application.
Yeah, so it's nice that this test highlights this. It's not nice that you're now onto a trail on how to fix these things, but that's probably your job. And yeah, cool.
So you can use it like this. These are just convenient services, and in this one particular, I'm testing all the different ways of specifying routes. And when testing, there's this router.create URL tree. There's router.navigate. There's router navigate by URL, and then there's the location.path. So I'm using all of those APIs to make sure we can support that in Spectacular.
Awesome. Is there something else you'd like to show on this file or like to highlight on?
This is a pretty complicated one, but I hope that you can somewhat see that the intention is to test as a user, not to be talking about components in the test, but to say, I click this button, I enter this text. Now I see, like you could do, you don't have to wrap that in helper function, and that's not a requirement by Spectacular. It's just a personal preference to remove some noise from the actual test. So make it clear, why are you asserting this? I'm asserting it because I want to see that I'm on the Crisis Center homepage. Or I have a specific crisis being edited on another page. Because those two lines there, 25 and 26, like, what do they tell you? If they pass, sure, but why? What are they testing? So this doesn't have anything to do with Spectacular. It's more of this, what are you expecting on behalf of the user? So it's speaking the language of testing as a user. You don't have to do this, but it's just if you look at the test, they should read more clearly, hopefully.
Yeah, it definitely looks concise. I really need to work with it in order to fully appreciate it. But
so then the next interesting thing is integrating it with the Angular testing library. by Tim.
Right.
And I do have an example of that directly in the code base if you want to see that.
Yeah.
It's in a different branch here in Ngworkers. So you have to switch from the main branch. And yeah, what is it called?
Probably this one.
Yeah, I wanted to see whether I needed to add more to the API to integrate it with the Angular testing library, because I didn't know for sure. I thought I took it into account when I was designing the API, but I wasn't sure until I tried it myself. And luckily, yeah, you should go into the Angular testing library folder one level up,
Yeah.
and or it was right.
Sorry.
Go to
Yeah.
the feature testing again on the top one. So it turned out I didn't have to add anything. I already had everything I needed.
Oh, really? It would
So
just worked.
now we're getting into a lot of the API of the Angular testing library, which is also test as a user and make it convenient to test a component as a user or a few components or navigating.
Very
And it
cool.
highlights accessibility of your application as well, because that's more closer to the user. But what's interesting here is, well, you can see all of the ways, like rather than having that custom user interaction wrapper, now I'm using the Angular testing library to fire events and read elements from the screen and things
Yeah.
like that.
So this
So
is the fire.
that's how it's meant to be used, with another library for these things, because I didn't want to reinvent the wheel. I wanted to
Yeah.
focus on configuring the test bed and the router testing module. That's what
Yeah.
the feature testing API hides away. And then it adds these two convenience services if you want to use them: the spectacular feature router and the spectacular feature location service.
Awesome. Yeah, very cool. I want to quickly go over some highlights because I've been ignoring our visitors for a long time. We have Connie here.
Right.
Hola, Connie. Buenas tardes. Connie is learning
I
Spanish and she's doing a great job. Serkan as well is here, one of the team members. Always good to be here. And then a special mention, my brother. I don't think he's online anymore. I don't hope he's watching us discussing testing for 20 minutes.
What's
But
he saying?
nice to see you sparring, like in English, sparring partner, just discussing stuff. Bakkie erbij, which is a cup of coffee. Like this
Oh.
is work. So he's also a freelancer, and we often discuss the benefits, the perks of having your own time and designing things, and the fact that I can just do this at 11 in the morning without a boss bossing me around is a lot of freedom. And then we have a salute from Dominique. Dominique, nice to see you. You're actually featured in this episode, but you just don't know it yet. But you've got to mention
Nice.
somewhere. And we have Bill again. And Bill asked, have you written any of the topic of micro frontends? How would you go about that in an NX workspace? And then afterwards, he says, perhaps cool for the stream at some other point. But any pointers to micro frontends would be cool. Now, when I think about micro frontends in NX, the first name that comes to mind is Manfred Steyer. And I definitely think Manfred is on the forefront of doing microservice in the Angular community, probably. So that's definitely a resource. Do you have anything, Lars? Have you written anything?
Yeah, Manfred Steyer's content is closer to Angular, not specifically about NX. But yeah, he wrote an article series about module federation in particular,
Right.
and also how you can do the same thing without module federation. That was before it was publicly available in Angular, because it needed Webpack 5.
Right.
So yeah, those are good resources for sure. But there's this guy in the Angular community he goes by the name of FlashMe, or just Flash.
Yeah.
And right now I forgot his name, unfortunately, but he created a repo called Angular Micros. No, what's it called? Angular Micro Frontends.
Yeah.
So he's doing it in practice every day in a big corporation. So he really knows what he's talking about. So you should check out his work. And finally, Natalia Mendito has an article on This is Learning about micro front ends in general, and do you need them? When do you need them? Things like that. This was a very popular article, so it's really good. And we actually did, the two of us, Natalia and I, we did a stream with Santosh on micro front ends in general. So there's a lot of resources being linked, and like we mentioned, a lot of different resources, and some of them are hopefully in the description of that episode on YouTube.
Very cool. Do you use them yourself, micro front ends, in any of your apps?
No, I had a client who was sure they needed them because they were doing microservices, so surely they needed micro front ends. But I convinced them you really don't need them. That's not your problem. They're not for free. They bring in some additional complexity and tooling, especially, and you want to make sure that you need the benefits that they bring, such as individual deployability and testing and deploying in isolation, and the code having that in somehow in isolation. It doesn't mean that you have to have a separate repo per micro front end. You can still have it in a mono repo. That's a different thing.
Yeah. I can see that it's kind of similar with microservices, where how do you say it? A lot of people are attracted by the idea, which I think is very valid. And if you like separation of concerns and all that, but it's kind of hard to figure out what you buy into if you don't have experience. And I've worked on teams where we went microservices all the way for a year, and then at a certain point we're like, might actually start rebuilding stuff inside our monolith. And I don't think it's bad. I think it's probably better to do these kind of cycles than just forcing to these kind of splits if they're not really natural. And like I'm often on very small teams, maybe 5 people maximum, the last years. So it's all generally very well manageable in one team. And especially if you already use like a mono repo and you can separate things nicely out into features or libraries, and you can tell people like, you know what, just spin up an app that only hosts your part of the app and you're fine. It's basically kind of the opposite. But they'll definitely note it here, and I will definitely put this on the large list of things I want to eventually feature. Now, nice. We're in about an hour. We didn't write a line of code, which is kind of against what we generally do. How about we set it up quickly and we start?
Let's look at one more thing. If you scroll up to the setup, that's where it becomes interesting, because that's where it shows how you actually use it in collaboration with so Spectacular and the Angular testing library. So render is from Angular testing library. You pass it the component you want to test, but we want to test a whole feature. So how would we tell it that? Well, we have this Spectacular app component, which will be the root component for this testing app. It's not your code, it's by Spectacular.
Yeah.
And then the next one is about if you have a scam, you have to set this to true. Right. And behind the scene, there is a scam actually for this Spectacular app component, so that's why. And finally, we have to import. So similar to Spectacular, Angular testing library also has the imports and providers here in its own API rather than in the test bed. So the final thing here is importing the Spectacular feature testing module with feature. That's the only way you can call that one. And then you pass it the same options as you saw before: feature module, feature path.
So in a sense, let's say your Spectacular app component is basically your app component. I can imagine it has a router outlet in there, and that's more or less it. And
yes, that's exactly it.
Cool. So that kind of makes sense to me directly. And what I see here is that you actually wrap your Angular app, which in our case is just a very small, lightweight app with one feature. You wrap it inside your Angular testing library, and then from the Angular testing library point of view, you can just consider this is one app. Doesn't matter, it only has one feature. And then inside Spectacular, you can do the things we just discussed earlier on today.
So
this is very interesting.
The Angular testing library does have a way of specifying routes, but the thing is, it's very difficult to configure the router testing module for a whole feature.
Right.
So the options for the routes there in the Angular testing library is more for one component and maybe another one that it routes to, but not for a whole feature. That would
Yeah.
be tricky to set up, and that's what Spectacular hides away. So in this case, Angular testing library is doing most of the work. We provide you with the root component, which has a router outlet and a way to access that in property if you need it. And then setting up the router testing module behind the scenes. And those are the two components you need, like the two things you need to integration test. It looks easy here. If you do it on your own, it's very complicated.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, it's always easier to read code than write code. I mean, at least from my point of view. I was about to suggest that we look into our app and we actually go ahead, but I do have some other things lined up, and I think you as well have quite a few things going on. I want to briefly show the app that I kind of set up, and here, Dominic, is your mention. I added some of our friends, just a few of them. Sorry for all of those that I missed, but this was just what came to mind. But I think what might be a better idea, if you're up to it, that I'm going to extend this app a little bit. I'm going to make it a bit more interesting, add a little form, add a little logic, and add some routing so we can actually show the power of this. Because if we're just going to test this thing, which you already mentioned when I showed you the demo, this is not the most interesting use case. So if you're up to it, let's do a follow-up on Spectacular, part 2, and look at how we actually use it at some point.
Yeah, I mean, I have another half an hour before my hard deadline with my family, but we could set up basic routing, or basic testing for the navigation part on an integration test level. But we could also do a follow-up or both. I guess you decide.
Yeah,
I'm up for whatever you want.
I'd love to do it, but I really actually gotta more or less go. Not really hard, but I still have to prepare. So
Sure.
And I have the habit of the last 3 episodes of doing cliffhangers. So we did 2 episodes on React Akita, but we never touched on Akita. But we went on a whole. Well, you've been there. We had a whole lot of interesting stuff about React. No, I'd love to dive in right away. So next time we'll figure it out offline when that's going to be. But then next time we just can dive in straight away and look at that. I think that's a more fruitful approach. And then we have a clean mind and we can just spend the whole session on actually implementing it.
Great. Well, we did see some spectacular code today. Both without another library and with the Angular testing library. But of course, it's more fun to get your hands dirty yourself. So we'll do that the next time, I guess.
Yeah. That sounds awesome. Yeah, we definitely had a great introduction. Thanks a lot for showing us around and how it's actually being used. And so my task is to up this app a little bit. I'll add a little bit more interesting things so we have actually something to look at. And then Dominic says, I think I never was the example name in one of the stream. This is your first, Dominic. And Dominic is also on the list to be invited at some point. I'd love to see his plugins for NX. He made Svelte, I think, Flutter. I'm not sure. But yeah, so that's also. But I got quite a long list already. So cool. I think we're going to have a wrap with this. This is one of the few streams that just take 1 hour. But yeah, at least I'm super happy we've got this out here. It also, I think, can be a nice reference for other people that want to understand Spectacular and how it works and why it works this way. So thanks a lot, Lars, for joining me on such short notice. We'll
thanks
follow
for
up.
inviting me.
Always good to have you, and we'll follow up soon with Spectacular Part 2. Thanks, everybody. I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.